I'm going to just quickly introduce our first presentation. I'm really excited. One of the benefits of hybrid, we have to keep looking at the silver linings because that changes our experience a little bit. So the next presentation is focused on Michigan, and Mark Holmes is in 2 places at once because we have hybrid. So thank goodness for us that he can contribute to both. That's really wonderful, because if we didn't have this option, he would not be in Dallas virtually, and we wouldn't get to learn from their awesome work. So who do I have? I don't even have my notes in front of me. We have Sheila and Mark Holmes. What's that?
And Kevin.
And Kevin
Sigwart,
can't forget Kevin. So I'm going to hand it off to them and enjoy. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Kevin, you kicking off? Okay.
Yeah, sure. I'll kick it off. Thanks, everybody. Mark is going to be presenting today on the building the foundations of spatial data infrastructures in the state of Michigan. So how we kind of broken down this session is Mark's going to we have a little mental meter poll just to kind of set the stage. So feel free to answer it when we get to that section, or as we're going through the presentation, and maybe some of the stuff that Mark's going to talk about may also help you with that particular piece. Meanwhile, Sheila, who is, everyone knows Sheila, she's the CEO for One Spatial Inc. She's going to be monitoring the chat window. So if you have any questions, put them in there, and then Sheila, depending on the question, maybe Sheila will interrupt Mark if she feels that it should be answered now, or we'll wait till the end to answer the questions during the Q&A part. Then my contribution is we put together a little demonstration showing the user experience of the workflow of uploading data to the MGF and how it gets processed through the system. So, but before we get to all that, Mark should probably talk about the system, and then by the way, this is the Mentimeter poll. You can use the QR code or go to menti.com and put in the information. And as I said, we'll go back and we'll show the results of it at the end of the presentation also to kind of also help spark the Q&A. So Mark, with that, I'll just pass it over to you.
All right, very good. Good morning, everyone. As Jenna said, I'm in 2 places this week, so 2 conferences. Our state conference started yesterday morning in Boyne Resort, Michigan. So that's the background I've added here to my my video. So we are just kick things off. Bill Johnson did a keynote this morning here on his Carpe Geo Parvin Momentum, really getting things kicked off well with our state conference this morning. Tied into that, I want to talk a little bit about Michigan Geographic Framework. So a lot of the things of the collaboration and work being done here in Michigan. So my role is Geospatial Services Manager with Michigan, work in the state's IT department, manage the enterprise infrastructure for the state agencies, but we also have a lot of outreach to our local units of government here in Michigan. And the Michigan Geographic Framework has been around for over 20 years now, as both a program and a platform with basically our statewide base mapping data. And for a number of years, we had been using that. Our office had managed a lot of the editing, working with the state agencies and their source information, but a lot of the editing was done within one system within our office. And about 4 years ago, started looking at a new vision for that Michigan Geographic Framework. More of a data hub with distributed editing across state governments, state agencies, and local governments, and bringing more authoritative data that was being developed at the local levels, as well as there was more staffing in some of those state agencies managing their own data now and wanting to take over that editing rather than in our office and us just focus on the data hub. So we needed the technology to bring that data together. So that's when we started looking at a new distributed model for editing and bringing that data into one system. So from a Michigan standpoint, that MGF data hub is really at the core of a lot of things happening. So that network of networks bringing in a lot of different systems from DOT, Department of Natural Resources, a lot of other state agencies as well with their authoritative data, and then with our local partners that have rich authoritative data there, addresses, parcel data, those kinds of things. So we need a technology that would have a standard schema that would allow us to bring in data from various schemas integrated into one statewide data set to then be able to distribute out for any other uses. It was through our open data, working with federal partners, academia, and just for GIS analytics. So some of the guiding principles as we developed the new technology and looking at things, we really wanted to make sure that across the state of Michigan, our GIS community, we're creating data once, using it many times, using data from those authoritative sources, data classifications by the data owner. So our system, we don't dictate what that data classification is. So the data owners are determining if that's open data, if it needs to be confidential, those kinds of things. The system can handle the various data classifications through our security policies. And then the importance of regular data updates and maintenance. Having a system that would allow for that on-ramp for allowing our contributors to provide data in a manner that was as easy as possible to do it. And which helped. Barriers of adoption in the past had been providing data sometimes wasn't as so simple. So providing updates sometimes became a barrier of adoption. So we wanted ease of use in terms of being able to provide the updates, having the metadata out there, and any kind of sharing agreements that we needed in place. But really that data and the foundation for consistent data for decision making across local, state, up to federal, and out to the public. So one of the other things in Michigan that was going on back around 2015, 2016, the governor at that time had started an enterprise information management program. So that really looked at improving data sharing, data flow across state agencies, across government, and across the state and government entities. So there were a number of different work streams within there. Some of it was helping improving data sharing agreements, indexing of data, identifying data, but two big pieces in there as well were from the data standpoint, the identity master and the location master. So identity is all the person index, people information, and then the location. So that's that geographic, that XY, and having that data. So XY of addresses, boundary data, and where those boundaries are and how it ties into other data in the state. So our Michigan Geographic Framework was identified as that location master platform where we would have that data stored and accessible. Then obviously all of that stuff feeds into analytics for the state to do, and from the geographic standpoint, adding that spatial dimension. So the Michigan Geographic Framework had always been modeled along the National Spatial Data Infrastructure themes and building it out in that fashion. And this project that started 3 or 4 years ago from a planning perspective is really building upon that and really developing that hub, not just for use within against the state, but also being able to roll up to federal partners and try to open our data up a little bit more, which is still a work in progress. But again, authoritative contributors providing that data in and making it accessible. Beyond the themes, we have a lot of other data that comes from multiple sources or contributors that want to provide data into the hub to be able to make it accessible through open data and other means, sort of that point A to point B to get it from their editing out to publication and into applications. So we'll talk a little bit about those layers as we go through here. So we'll talk about centerlines. Centerlines first. An example of where there are, as we went through and planned this out, multiple stakeholders, multiple contributors that provide information in from a centerline standpoint. We have the DOT with the information, their linear referencing system that they have within the roads and highways platform. We wanted to be able to bring information, not just geometry from there that they manage, but also some of the linear referencing information they have. Speed limits, functional class, the type of things that we can use to add on, for example, to our statewide tile cache, and being able to have the cartographic display of our data, and having some of those attributes that they provide that are important to that. Local governments and some of the 911 data coming in. So the addressing information is key, but also those updates coming in from center lines there. We have our Department of Natural Resources with their forest roads. Forest roads were identified as important for our emergency management, and having the availability of that data. And not that this goes into every data set that goes out there, but to have it available. So if emergency management wants to pull in a combination of all of these roads from a reference standpoint, they can. Or local 911, if they want to pull this in, they now have the forest roads from the DNR, as well as the U.S. Forest Service. They've indicated in the future that they would like to add in some of the road network that they have in the state forest lands, or state U.S. forest lands, national forest lands in our state. So bringing those together into one hub where we're staging the data, but then pushing it out from a publication standpoint. So again, out to open data, if it's out to the 911 repository, and we'll talk about that a little bit here on this slide. So this also ties into that. I talked about the coordination and collaboration that's been going on the last few years to really try to get to a point of more data sharing between our local governments and the state. So we've been able to work some partnerships whereby we share some of the imagery from our statewide imagery program and some of the costs of that for local governments in exchange for their parcel data, their address point data. At this point, for state government use, some entities are making it open, not all, still a work in progress there, but we have that flow, and that MGF data hub is really that central part of bringing the data in one statewide data set. That feeds our 911 repository that I'll talk about here in a couple of minutes. But that 911 repository has been around for 7 or 8 years now, where our local 911 or local GIS providing their center lines. Their address points will be in the new system as well. Response zones, fire, police, EMS, and we maintain the PSAP boundaries for the state. So that's aggregated into one statewide platform, with the new MGFs going to have a more seamless easy to use interface for them to map fields and get data into the system. But that's what's going to feed for our call routing functions for next gen 911. So those providers will be able to pull the GIS data from there. But local 911 can also log into this system through our single sign-on and download data from their surrounding counties, for example. So it opens up more data interoperability for 911. So not only providing their data in, some of the benefit is now they can pull it out of one statewide set. So here's an example, again, as of a contributor. So if I'm a GIS department supporting 911 or the PSAP, maintaining the GIS data there, once they're set up through our single sign-on, they can be drag and dropping their shape files or file geodatabases into the system. So from here, they're able to map their fields, where they'll be able to set to the statewide schema what their fields are in their local data set, and then it'll process. We have a number of validations. I think it's up to about 300 now, working with One Spatial through setting up those different NINA rules and validations to the NINA standard. So our old system had a couple of dozen. We've added a lot more tied to some of the new data model within here. So it will go through that step and run the validations and put the data into the MGF data hub and into that 911 repository. So part of that is also providing some of the analytics back to those contributors. So this new system, we wanted to make sure we had the ability for not only our staff to be able to see and track the submissions that are happening. When did somebody update their data last? How often? But also that contributor can see that information and log in and view it. It can also see some of the analytics tied to some of the validations. So what kind of validations have been flagged? You know, what are the most validations that get flagged? You know, each time they upload. Maybe there's some analytics there that help them determine. Maybe there's some things they need to fix. Maybe there's some training things that need to occur with some of the data maintenance. So it helps them in discussions with our local partners. They saw that as a benefit to them as well. So that's built into not just for the 911 repository, the data coming in the 911 repository, but for all the layers that are going to be submitted through the data hub. And just an example of an application then pulling data in from that data hub. So part of our repository has a web-based viewer within here that the PSAPs can log into. Obviously, they have their own mapping with their computer-aided dispatch. This is an additional enhancement where they're able to if their computer dispatch can't see the surrounding counties, or maybe they get a call that is not in their area, maybe it's another part of the state for some reason it came in, they can search it through this system. And we've added things like the DNR trails, or hospital, schools, so some of those other layers that are in the data hub, the 911 community wanted to see on a separate map in case they needed it. So we had built that simple viewer in there for them. But an example, again, from a data interoperability standpoint of using it for a 911 emergency management purpose. And then the download. So again, 911 can go into this particular system and be downloading this data out of the statewide file for themselves for the CAD. And they can map the fields when they go and export out. They can map the fields back to a schema. So if they have a computer-aided dispatch that has a specific schema, they can map it back to that on the download, save it. So they can be adding 6 or 7 counties, if that's how many surround them, or a bigger region, and pull that data out. And so again, just an example from our 911 repository of how the data in the data hub can then be utilized by another system. So I'm going to take just a couple minutes here and talk about culverts. Culverts has been a popular popular feature in Michigan for the past couple of years. A lot of culvert collection going on. The DOT's captured all the culverts on their state maintained roads, trunk line roads. And we have a Transportation Asset Management Council that has done a pilot with a lot of the local road owning agencies in collecting culverts, as well as some of the work we've been doing with Michigan State University over the past couple of years with some proof of concept projects with deriving hydro from LiDAR data, which we're getting ready to kick off a project here with Quantum Spatial Michigan State University. So culverts are going to be a big part of that as well for hydro enforcement. But when we did our outreach to our stakeholders a few years ago, culverts was really identified as need for when improving the hydro, but being able to do the hydrologic modeling as well. And then obviously there are a lot of different tools out there that could be used to collect culverts. So again, this is an example of multiple contributors, maybe using different systems, different schemas. We set a standard schema in the data hub for culverts, and then folks can map their data, the contributors can map their data into the data hub for one statewide master inventory of culverts. So that's a work in progress here on the culvert side, but the data hub will be the repository for that. And again, just to that central system that provides data out for multiple things. We want to build a better geocoder than exists today. So the data that's coming into here is going to be the backbone for a future geocoding service that we want to develop out there as an example. But really making that data, that authoritative data, accessible for use either within the state or through open data to others. And then, so that concludes the background and the story of the Michigan Geographic Framework and our new technology. We're in testing mode now, so we're going through final testing on a lot of those layers to get them into full production here over the next month. So we're almost to the finish line tied to that. And I'm going to hand it over to Kevin, I think.
Yes, thanks, Mark. Before you hit the next button, give me like 30 seconds because this is about 8 minutes and I gotta talk fast. So I just want to set up. I want to set up the demonstration. So what we're going to be showing here is the process of getting the data into the MGF. So how does the data flow from the locals that are working on the data sets and pushing that all the way into the MGF geodatabase, which then serves out these open data or these his enterprise GIS system that's operating inside of Michigan. So with that, Mark, you could just hit the next button. You don't have to actually hit play because it will just, yep, there we go. So basically what we're looking at here is we have the source data set that's inside of an Esri enterprise geodatabase. And we have the blue lines are the updated parcels. So I'm a local, I'm going through, I made some changes to my parcel data set. This may be creating some new parcels, updating some attribution, and so forth. And what we want to, what the state of Michigan wants to provide is a way to get this data that's been updated into their central repository, but only updating those actual changes. We don't want to necessarily have to do a rip and replace every time you're sending an update. And that way you can keep all the rich metadata associated with the feature. So you're only seeing, as it's editing and as those edits are being changed. So this is just showing that, yes, we have made some changes. We've updated, the editor has updated the data. For example, in this case, maybe the sales price has changed or the assessed value has changed. And as we saw yesterday with the broadband, this information can be very useful for doing analytics for, things like infrastructure and so forth. So beyond just, having a nice parcel data set that has a lot of uses. So basically, after you do your edits, you can log into the MGF system in order to submit the data. And you have a set of assignments associated with yourself, what you have permission to update data to. And in this case, this particular county has this particular individual has the ability to submit parcel data. So like Mark showed in the slide, you can just drag and drop that updated data set into the application. And then it's going to read that data set. It's going to say, well, okay, does this data set actually have the same schema as the schema that the state's expecting? If it doesn't, it's going to provide an interface for you to do the schema mapping. Now, when you do that schema mapping, it's typically a one-time deal. You do that, then you can save that schema, and then you can reuse that schema for the next time you submit that data. So it gives you that ability to just do the schema mapping once. Now, if you change your schema, you'll obviously have to update that again as need be. So then once we go through, once you do the schema mapping step, you then go ahead and just go through the processing step. So then we hit continue, and it goes to the processing step. So at this part, what's going to happen is that data that's been uploaded is going to get processed. So it's going to take that data, it's going to bring that data into the system, but then it's going to also bring data from other locations, because you're going to not just validate that individual data set, you may want to compare it to other data sets in the system. So it's going to pull the data from that Esri geodatabase, the source system. And then it's going to bring those two data sets together. It's going to run it through some pre-processing steps. And then it's going to run it through a series of validation checks. And those validation checks are configured based off the different layers. So parcels have a certain set of validation checks. And then, other data sets will have other validation checks, like the NG911 data sets. And then here we're flagging that pause. What that pause is doing is we call it a conditional pause. So basically, as long as the data meets a certain threshold, it will get passed through that particular pause. If it doesn't, it will kick them out and say, hey, you need to make these changes in order for the state to accept. And then there's some other post-processing steps, which I'll actually highlight in a second anyway, when we come back to it. So this takes a few minutes to run. So we're going to go back and look at a previous run. So the nice thing about it is the end user can also go back and look at any other previous run and get metrics on any of their previous runs. So this is one that was run shortly before when we were doing the video. And so you're noticing here that we're getting some conformance percentages. This is where we're setting what percent does it need to make. So we're saying it must be 75%. If it does, it kicks through. And then what we're going to do is we're going to kick off a workflow manager job. So this is what's orchestrating the workflow through the system. So once that data gets uploaded, there needs to be some way to say, okay, what's the next step? So we're using workflow manager to support that effort of the actual workflow. And we'll get back to that in a second, but say there is an issue with the data set. Well, if there's an issue with the data set, you can download a report, and that report is a spatial report that can be brought into your GIS application of choice. So if you are a local editor and using ArcMap or ArcGIS Pro, you can download that file geodatabase or that shapefile and then bring that into your GIS application of choice to make those corrections. That way, the next time you submit data, or the next time the local submits data, they're going to get a better data set. And the nice thing about giving them that spatial report is that it actually empowers them to actually make those changes, because it's going to show them where the issues are at. Beyond just getting that spatial report, Mark showed this before, that you're also getting metrics on how often are you submitting data as a data supplier? How is the data quality changing over time? What are the rules that are the biggest pain points? And just like you have this at the individual supplier level, all of this is being rolled up. So as the state, they can come in and look and say, oh, this is how the quality is for all of my suppliers for a given layer, or even across all the layers themselves. I mentioned before, we kick off a workflow process. So when the contributor submits data, it's going to start going through this workflow process. And what we've got to at this point is we've validated it. It's gone through change detection. Those changes then are going to be reviewed by the state to say whether or not they want to accept or reject changes, because there may be cases where a change may not necessarily want to go into the enterprise geodatabase. after that review process happens, then there's a series of other validation checks, because before you integrate those changes, you may want to make sure that nothing else is going to break in the entire system. So validating across the entire system, and then that data gets pushed back into the enterprise geodatabase. So what we're looking at here now is that set of results that happened when it did that change detection. And that is also being written to the enterprise geodatabase so that it can be reviewed before those changes get committed back to the source record. So what we're seeing here is a variety of ads, and which means that basically a new parcel has been created, or a scalar change is what we call basically a change that where the attribution, the non-spatial attribution has changed. So maybe the assessed value has changed, or the sales price in parcels. This same process the same workflow is being done for a majority of the layers. Now, a caveat to that is Mark showed that the road center lines there's a lot more going on with road center lines. So there's the workflow is slightly different for road center lines. But for the parcel data or the addressing data and the NG911 data, it's going through a very similar process, just maybe a different set of business rules that's going to validate the data against, and maybe also a different set of post validation checks after that data gets integrated into the system itself. So this is, there we go. So then once those changes have been reviewed, we're not quite done yet. Once those changes get reviewed, then the workflow gets kicked off again. The user says, okay, I reviewed those. I marked accepted or rejected any sort of changes. I can then go to Workflow Manager, say, I've done doing my reviewing, go to the next step, and then the workflow continues through, and then it's going to do some additional validation checks and so forth. So that's what we're doing now. We're coming back to Workflow Manager, where you can go ahead and just say, okay, we're ready to move on to the next step. And then it's going to go through those last few steps where it's going to then integrate those data sets into that central repository. But as I mentioned before, there is a step where it's going to validate the entire enterprise data to make sure that you don't have any issues. Now, all of this data is being fed into an Esri geodatabase that's being served out as Esri REST services, so that when those changes get integrated into that central repository, they can be accessed via that online system. And this is just showing you that you can go into your GIS application, your mobile or your web-based GIS application of choice, open up a web map, or even open it up in ArcGIS Pro, and you have access. Assuming that you've been given authorization to access those services, based on what Mark was talking about before, you can then search and discover those data sets. So with that, I'll pass it. Actually, I think now at this point we have the Mentimeter poll. So do we want to?
Hey, Kevin?
Yes.
Can I just add one thing real quick, which probably everybody understood, but I just want to make sure it was clear, because when you were talking about the spatial report, initially you were originally talking about the what you were showing was actually the summary report, but what he showed when he started showing it in GIS is the actual updated spatial report.
And Mark, do you mind? I think I need to take control so I can bring up the Mentimeter poll. And I tried sharing my screen and it didn't let me do it unless you're with you sharing your screen.
So you need me to stop sharing?
Yes.
And then we do have a question.
Okay, you can. Why don't you ask that question while I'm bringing this up, Sheila?
Okay, so Eric asked, for the NG911 data export for dispatch CAD purposes, was that built with M1 Spatial as well? And I think I know, but I figured I better turn it over to the experts because I may mess it up.
No, that was developed. Our application development team developed that portion of it. So the viewer and the download tool were all developed by our application developers in our office.
That was a great question, Eric, because someone actually, when we did the demo run or the dry run, we had that exact same question come up.
That's right.
Was there any other questions that were in the chat window before we go through some of the Mentimeter poll questions?
Not anything I couldn't answer. There was a question from Jonathan about whether or not that when they were showing the one integrate and the analytics, if that was one integrate underneath the hood, and it's one integrate under the hood with the one data gateway portal.
All right. So just to go through some of the Mentimeter poll, and when I came up with these questions, a lot of these questions were things that came up actually out of the mid-year when we were doing the when we had the data governance session. So I figured maybe we should add some of these questions because this might be things also Mark may want to discuss after once we get to the Q&A, which we're at now. So we're talking about the do states provide data rollups to support SDIs? Let's see here. Does your organization require data share agreements or MOUs for each data provider? Mark, this is a good question for you. What do you guys do for the data agreements? Like, how do you guys set those up, and actually, how do you keep them? How do you maintain them?
Yeah, there's work behind that for sure. Administration of our memorandums of agreement. So we have intergovernmental agreements for our partnerships with local units of government. So the imagery exchange that I mentioned for parcel data and address point data and road center line data, those are all set up through intergovernmental agreements that get signed by our organization and the local unit of government. And they don't change. I mean, the language in there is fairly simple. So we try to do it that way so there aren't scenarios where we have to make a lot of changes to them, because then obviously we have to send those back out, get them all signed again. So primarily intergovernmental agreements, and just as we work through our outreach. So we have a team of a couple of folks and myself that do a lot of the outreach within the state. So it's continued. It's that team that make sure those are up to date, or if we have to, if there's a change, if there's maybe a signatory that's no longer at an organization, they may let us know, and we've got to make an update that way. But it's not it takes time, especially getting them set up in the first place and getting the partnerships. But we've been lucky and fortunate in the last 2 or 3 years here to really establish them. I think out of the 83 counties in Michigan for parcels, we're at, I think there's still 7 that we don't have partnerships. So pretty high percentage of ones that we do.
So we have one more question. You want me to go ahead and pop it in? It's Greg
Sure.
Bunce is asking, how is connectivity handled during aggregation with data sets such as road center line?
Great question. I wish Michael was on the call. So I know that as part of at the very end of the process, there's the MGF validate, which at the MGF validate is going to validate the entire enterprise. It's going to make sure that the road center lines are actually split at the actual intersection. So if it's not, it will flag that it isn't. And I'm going to say something, and Mark may say you're wrong, but I believe as part of the road center line post-processing piece, it actually updates the splitting. So if it's slightly off between where the where the county boundary is versus where the roads are split, it will actually update that automate that update to align those. And I believe that's what we're doing. But as I said, I would have to bring on the.
And Greg, yeah, we'll get back with Michael and maybe get you a little more expanded answer on that. How's that?
Did you want to add anything, Mark, to that?
No, but that's correct. Yeah, on the upload, or at the end, there's it goes through some processes to connect, handle the connectivity and.
So yeah, I was right. All right, there you go. Yep, I thought so, but I just didn't want to make sure I didn't say something that wasn't true.
That's what, as much as the weeds, I can go down into it myself. I don't need our technical team to respond any deeper to that, handling the data side of things.
And all of that, and just that, all of that is being done, like leveraging, the one integrated rules-based technology. So it's doing it in a very systematic way. So if something is happening that it's not expected, well, one, we're post-validating to make sure that we're not going to introduce any sort of issues, but it can then be reviewed and manually addressed. So there's always going to be a few corner cases that will need to be addressed, and the key is to catch them so that you can address them before they go into the enterprise system. Any more questions, Sheila, before we move on to the next Mentimeter slide?
Not seeing any yet.
All right. Does your organization keep those data sharing agreements up to date? Well, this is kind of I guess the last slide there was, I think most of the states were not, they didn't have data sharing agreements. So if you don't have a data sharing agreement, there's nothing to keep up to date. So that makes it easy. And then Mark already talked about how to keep them up to date. And then what we're doing is we had that listing those layers for that are contained within your SDI. And that's interesting because I would have thought that the biggest of the bunch would have been addresses and road center lines, but it looks like parcels is I guess it's the same. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. And parcels may be the largest of the bunch, and maybe because that's why road center lines and street center lines. See, I got
And transportation, they're all
yeah, road center line, non-plural. We got to work on Mentimeter on being able to aggregate those responses into one. And I think there was at the end. Where's your authoritative data SDI? This is just interesting. I know that with One Spatial we're helping out a lot of organizations with SDIs, especially around NG911, and they're some are on-prem, but then we've been seeing a lot more either going into either cloud hosting or even the data is actually being stored and hosted in ArcGIS Online. So this is more of just a curiosity question on my part on where your SDI data is being hosted and also and so forth. I think it's just interesting. And then very great. Mark, the one question you probably didn't want to answer. So
about data governance.
About data governance. And we still have about 4 minutes. So okay. I don't know if you wanted to talk a little bit about data governance in Michigan, and then if anybody else has any other questions to save Mark, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, so in the roll call of states, I did mention one of our goals upcoming is continued data governance. So this is one that it's just kind of a continuum, but working through, setting some of the schemas up front, some of the work done there of working with we do have so for example, with 911, we have a technical advisory committee that was put together as we upgraded our 911 repository and implementing the One Data Gateway and the One Integrate platform. So we work a lot through that advisory group, and on that advisory group, there's representatives from the 911 community, the GIS community, at the local level, state 911 office and our office. So we've been able to work through how we want the memorandum of agreements tied to intergovernmental agreements with that, as well as the schema, expectations from onboarding. So as we onboard the counties with their data, meeting with them, reviewing the data, making sure it has the minimum required fields, if not working with them to determine how we get to the point of adding fields or get them to the data to kind of the baseline standard within there. So that's one example. Within our state agencies, working through, we've got a steering committee, not a formal steering committee, but a steering committee that's has representatives from all the agencies that are utilizing GIS. So we work through with that team in terms of the data aggregation, the frequency of the updates, how we're dealing with some of the standards. There was a lot of work with the DOT on with the center lines from the 911 standpoint with the DOT, a lot of discussions there. So that part of, just the collaboration and having the conversations and getting the participation. So a lot of time on just those partnerships. So moving forward, a lot of it is going to be on, finalizing, some of these flows. We're going to learn stuff as we go through with the new platform as well. So it's going along in parallel. You're never going to get everything established up front. So our thought was, let's get the technology going and get folks on board, continue to get some of these data sharing agreements in place and continue to work on governance as we go.
Can I ask a quick question before we jump on to the other comments, Mark, because I'm curious about this now. I started thinking about data governance in general. And so it sounds like data governance, you're handling it on the GIS side. What about the other side of the house? The more, it might be more not focused on spatial data, but the data governance across the board at the state to make sure all databases are in alignment.
So there's the enterprise, I mentioned that enterprise information management program. So there's a chief, what they call chief data stewards. So there's chief data stewards in each of the agencies, part of that program that meet. And I'm not a chief data steward, but I of those monthly meetings they have there, then that group reports up to the Enterprise Information Management Steering Committee. So there's governance that way. We also have a process, and I saw a security question in there before on the data security side of things. Any data that goes into a system, so the Michigan Geographic Framework system, we had to go through a state security assessment, risk assessment as part of that application, that system being set up. So we had to go through all the data classifications of the data that's going to be in there. So that's part of the process as well, tied to this, and that's the security as well. So based off that data classification, then working with our various, we're already in IT, but we've got like telecom, cybersecurity, server teams, enterprise architecture. So working with those teams to make sure the architecture of our environment and servers are set up in the way to meet those data classifications. So,
and then one last thing for 30 seconds, and then I'll pass it over to you, Jenna, I swear. So there are a few other questions. I don't know who posted this question, so I can't go to you personally, but if you guys had those questions, feel free to ask Mark later, or you can ask one of us, and we can either, if we know the answer, we can answer it, or then we can, you guys know how to get a hold of Mark, so you can reach out to Mark, or we can continue. As Frank says, you can also continue this conversation on the forums. So thanks,
and
everybody.
We do have allocations, funding allocations for our enterprise geospatial that we get from the agencies. So we use that to manage our that budget, managing our staff resources, technology, some data projects that come up. So that's primarily where our funding comes for the different projects. So,
all right. Thanks, guys. That was amazing. And you made my MC job super easy. You handled all of that yourselves. So I am so impressed. And this is really near and dear to Arizona because we're going through the same thing. We just kicked off. So thank you for doing it first, Mark. That will help me.